Hello and welcome back to another episode of Dark Souls 3 Dissected. So far I've made videos about the invisible walls and weird collisions of Dark Souls 1 and 2, and today I'm here to finish off the trilogy by making another for Dark Souls 3. If you're new to the channel, or haven't seen either of the other Invisible Walls videos yet, both of them start off with an introduction talking about different collision types, and while I was considering doing the same here a third time, all of that information is quite redundant. So I'm just going to skip that this time, but don't worry, it's not prerequisite viewing for this video, because I'll just give the super fast summary right now. In order to be able to walk on the ground, or into walls without just falling out of the map, everything you see in the environment has to be covered with sheets of collision data. This is what the environment looks like, but this is what your character actually stands on and interacts with when they move around. Most environmental collisions are loose approximations of the visual geometry of the environment you see, but sometimes they're quite simplified because having a simpler, larger wall that covers something entirely is often the safer option. The developers don't want the player walking into and getting stuck in weird corners, or finding a way to get out of bounds, so sometimes we have extra sheets of collision that don't match the visible environment, and that's how we wind up with invisible walls. If you'd like a deeper explanation of the different collision types and how they're implemented in the Souls games, like simple collisions versus complex collisions, then you can also go back and watch the introduction of either one of my previous videos, which are linked below. But if knowing that stuff is important to understanding anything we come across here, I'll just explain it when we get to it in context. You already get the gist of what an invisible wall is, and that's all that matters. The purpose of today's video is to give a tour of the invisible walls of Dark Souls 3. I'm going to go through every area in the game and show what kinds of walls were implemented, as it gives us some insight to the concerns the developers had about navigating the environment. Plus, it's just kind of cool pulling back the curtain and seeing the actual shape of the game's environment, as opposed to the artifice we're presented when we play the game normally. Without further ado, let's get started. Right away, we'll find a lot of taller invisible walls surrounding the periphery. Even without them, it'd be pretty obvious we can't traverse these areas, but there's always the risk of being able to climb some things we're not meant to. So pretty much anytime we have things like large rocks and tombstones lining a wall, it's not uncommon for simpler and taller walls than what we can see to be completely covering all of that stuff. Over here, we can find some rock mounds that are covered with much taller cones. In this case, they didn't want us climbing the rocks, but instead of keeping us completely off with a tall, flat wall, they didn't mind if we got onto them a little bit and then immediately slipped off instead. You can make planes of collision that are slippery, so not every invisible wall has to be perfectly vertical. Down by the entrance to Udex Gundyr, we find our first invisible enemy wall. There are places in these games where there are invisible walls that only enemies can walk into, so it stops them from passing through, while the player will pass through them freely without having any idea that they're there. While it's pretty obvious that not letting a boss out of their arena would be pretty important, there's actually another primary reason why this should be here. Because a fog gate does go up during the boss fight, that has its own collision that stops both the player and the boss, so the enemy wall is not here for that purpose. It's here because this arena doesn't have a fog gate to start with, so there was always the risk that some lesser mobs could follow you in here if you ran past them. They overlooked this with the Clams and Seath boss fight in Dark Souls 1, so they probably wanted to avoid that here. With this invisible enemy wall, the hollows can't follow you in and won't join the boss fight. But invisible enemy walls are made out of something called low collision or simple collision. It's not made out of the kind of collision that projectiles impact. So while the hollows are physically unable to walk in here to follow you, they can still fire their crossbow bolts through this wall no problem, making it a little less obvious that it's here. The cliffside of the boss arena is also protected with an enemy wall. This is the standard for most boss fights in these games. If you ever find yourself trying to lure a boss to a cliff in the hopes that it falls to its death, but you can never quite pull it off, it's because most of the time that's impossible. We could literally take control of the enemy, and no matter how hard we try to get it to fall to its death, we're going to be stopped. If you're thinking, but wait, I've seen a few bosses fall to their deaths in these games before, that's because those are the exception. Those are boss fights where the developers intentionally omit invisible walls, knowing fully well that gravity would be an option for taking them down. But that is something done sparingly in these games, so you can assume that most boss arenas are protected with invisible enemy walls. Enemy walls were also put in place to prevent them from entering Firelink Shrine. They were incredibly thorough with this, even blocking this upper entrance where it should be impossible for any enemy to even follow you. A lot of the ruined walls surrounding Firelink Shrine are actually covered up with much taller invisible walls than we can see. This doesn't seem completely necessary to me, but they probably figured it was better safe than sorry to have players jump down and walk around on top of uneven surfaces that they might be able to get stuck on. Similarly, there's a set of coffins here that are completely covered up with a much taller dome extending above them. This would otherwise be something you wouldn't even have to jump on top of. You'd be able to just walk onto it had they not put this here. I think the only reason they wanted to keep you off of these is because they were surrounded by a bunch of stuff that the devs were worried you might get stuck on, so they just enveloped the entire thing to not worry about it. Now, when we get to the spot outside, the arrangement of coffins naturally provides a wall that stops us from going further in this direction, but toggling the collisions on helps reveal the intent with which the developers didn't want you to go this way. This small tree and rock got a pretty severe wall covering it, and this tree off to the side has a large wall blocking it as well. They just really wanted you to go through Firelink Shrine first to get here. One thing they didn't protect is this notorious shortcut, though, where you can jump off of the root of this tree to get onto the roof early. This allows for getting some very important items earlier in your playthrough. Short of moving, reshaping, or removing the tree entirely, they didn't really have a lot of great options for invisible walls here, aside from maybe like a cylinder that wrapped around the base of the tree. It would be a bad idea to put them here to block the shortcut, because then we'd get stuck on them trying to walk back off of the roof. They haven't invented one-way invisible walls for these games, and you don't want to be surprised with obvious invisible walls like that. If you ever had trouble pulling this shortcut off, because it can be a little tricky, a closer look at the tree's collision helps reveal what's actually there and how to best interact with it. Maybe other players have more reliable setups, but what seems to work best for me is using this collision here. You want to run up and along this, and even though this part looks really steep, you do want to try and reach and jump off from here, essentially. Here's another look again with the collision disabled. If we go to this area behind Firelink Shrine by the Crystal Lizard, we'll find that a taller invisible wall thoroughly blocks this wall of rocks. Though doing something like this helps reveal the potential for abuse or creating new problems when trying to solve another. Because this wall is so tall, it creates a survivable fall from the bridge above. You can land on top of and walk along razor-thin collision like this when it's completely vertical, and I did find one spot where you can make the jump. Not that anyone would ever want to go here in particular, but it helps show how collisions can sometimes be exploited. I'm a big fan of bringing attention to these weird spots, so if you want to try this yourself, consider going online and leaving a message here that says illusory wall. While we're here, we can also use the tower as a good demonstration of how the death camera and kill planes work. There's a good chance you've seen or heard of a glitch in the Souls games where you can enter death cam mode without dying. That's when the camera shifts to this weird top-down view and then controlling your character becomes a bit of a nightmare, but it is something that can sometimes be exploited for speedruns. But if the death cam being triggered is an event that's associated with falling off of cliffs and dying, how can it sometimes be survivable? Well, the answer to that is incredibly simple. It's because the death cam has its own plane of collision, independent of the one that actually kills the player. This is the death cam plane up here, and this one below is the kill box or kill plane. There's sometimes some space between them, the logic being that they want the camera to pan down first, and then not have you die until a moment later, because that's just a better way of animating or conveying your death. It just looks nicer than having it happen too suddenly. There's a reason to not always just put them in the exact same spot, and there usually aren't any issues relating to this, because if you're falling through the death cam plane, like, where are you going to go? You almost always have nothing safe to land on, and it's essentially guaranteed that you're going to hit the death plane a moment later as well. But I should emphasize that I just said almost always. There are occasionally places where these aren't flawless with their implementation, so you can do some messing around once you know where to find these spots. That almost wraps up the cemetery and Firelink Shrine. If you're wondering about the Untended Graves version of Firelink, there's really nothing to see there. It's the same map, so as far as I'm aware, the collisions are the same. While these games are capable of loading different collisions based on event flags, so the same map could have different collisions depending on context, I haven't spotted anything like that being done here. Instead, we only have more limited movement in the area because they leaned into just manipulating objects directly. No new collisions are needed if you just make these doors closed and inoperable, and take this ladder away. But otherwise, it's not like there's a bunch of new invisible walls here or anything, at least none that I could find. And while we're going to explore most of the areas in an order that makes sense gameplay-wise, I figured I might as well jump to the endgame to wrap up that version of Firelink 2. The Kiln Firelink of course has invisible walls that fully block off the rubble piles to stop us from going upstairs. And all the lower rubble piles are thoroughly sealed up as well. The exterior also has tall invisible walls to ensure that we can't explore anywhere around the side. But if you're wondering how much else of Firelink is intact if we could find a way to get out of bounds, the answer is not at all. There aren't collisions in the unreachable areas, and stuff like the rafters above aren't even textured properly. This shows that they weren't too lazy in how they copy and pasted the Firelink Shrine set piece to this area. They did strip it down in the way that it should have been. The path up to Soul of Cinder has most rocks, rubble, and melted columns covered up as well. And here's what the perimeter to the boss room looks like. Though at the bottom of the path, they probably should have been a little more aggressive with invisible walls. While these tombstones being covered looks pretty thorough, like where would you even jump from here, it turns out that you can jump off from the steep part of this cliff while sliding down it to get out of bounds. And while we're back here, with some persistence, there's a small area we can mess around in. There's not much to do up here, but it should have been covered up if for no other reason than multiplayer. While I'm a fan of players engaging in multiplayer in unconventional ways, like hosts getting invaded on purpose but hiding somewhere unusual to turn it into a game of hide and seek, it becomes a little too unfair if one player knows how to exploit an out-of-bounds location. It's just not reasonable to expect another player to figure out how to get back there and fight you. But since the cat's out of the bag here, I'm not the first person to point this location out, consider leaving another out-of-bounds message that says illusory wall. We can keep some players guessing if there's some secret area or path they haven't found yet. The first thing that stands out to me are the really tall invisible walls that can be found near the very start of the level. While this doesn't happen on literally every single staircase, it's incredibly common for them to get invisible walls in these games. It's so common that I've started referring to them as railing protection at this point, giving them their own name because you find them everywhere. It's prominent enough for me to see it as its own type of invisible wall by now. Staircases can often use the help of invisible walls because the shape of them makes it easy to do a running jump over the railing as you're descending them, which the developers might not always want you to be able to do. What we find here does stand out to me a bit from the usual railing protection we find, though. That's usually achieved by adding an invisible wall that's just a little bit taller than the railing you can see. That's usually sufficient, but here they made them really tall for whatever reason. Down by the shortcut elevator, I noticed that the tower wasn't consistently protected with invisible walls. The right side of the tower was completely covered up, while the left side was left open, where you can jump over and hit a kill plane. This was almost certainly done because of how the surrounding out-of-bounds terrain is conveyed to us. On the left, there is a decent fall, so it doesn't look too bad or surprise us when we hit a kill plane. But on the right, there's an out-of-bounds tower we're not meant to be able to get on top of. So if the invisible wall wasn't here, dropping from the railing and then dying when it looks like there's a safe landing not far down would feel pretty lame. This reminds me of a kind of sloppy death plane implementation in Bloodborne, where you could easily fall a short distance to somewhere they didn't want you to go and die as a result. So seeing the invisible wall here in Dark Souls 3 is a good example of how they usually try to avoid that from happening when they can. For the same reason they didn't protect the railing on the left side, there's a few other walls here that didn't get invisible walls protecting them. So we can land on top of them, but with nowhere to go and the pitfalls covered with death planes, this all looks fine as it is to me. Underneath the crossbow hollow, there's this invisible wall that connects all the way up to the platform above. They didn't want you getting stuck in this empty space to the side of the staircase, so they covered it up from all sides to help ensure that doesn't happen. So there's a bit of an invisible ramp to slide down here. Most of the area surrounding the Pus of Man has taller invisible walls surrounding it as well. They probably just wanted some extra safety against cheesing him, or having a larger enemy knock you over ledge that they didn't intend to be a pitfall. While most of this area is properly surrounded by kill planes, if we were able to get up on one of these walls, you'd be able to see how the map just cuts off. Like, there's no texture down there, so we can see a void in the map below. Not being able to stand somewhere where you can see that too clearly might have been another consideration for putting invisible walls here. I've seen other spots in these games where it seemed like that was the logic behind that. But now that we know that's there, it's pretty obvious that we can see it from inbounds too. Granted, most players aren't going to be staring down at their feet when walking upstairs into an area with enemies in it, but if you do that, then you can see this gap in the map anyways. While we're up here, I'd like to point out the invisible wall blocking the staircase, which stops us from exploring a small out-of-bounds area above. Maybe there's still some way of getting out of bounds here, but I've seen videos of players getting out of bounds by the second bonfire instead, which I've been able to pull off as well, but I haven't been able to pull it off by the Pus of Man. While the shape of the staircase is identical, down to the exact ways in which the bricks are uneven and the rubble on top of it, both versions of the collisions didn't come out exactly the same, which explains why they're different. The wall itself is slightly different, but more importantly, the shape of the staircase's collision is different. We have a more severe change of angles on the Pus of Man staircase, while the second bonfire staircase has a more gradual incline to it. It's that perfectly awkward amount of steep where your character can quickly run up it, and if you jump while ascending the steeper part, it gives your jump a bit of a boost. This is enough to get you out of bounds here, allowing you to bypass the invisible wall they put up. You know the drill by now. This is going to be another location where I start leaving messages that say illusory wall, trying my best to make them visible to other players. And compared to where we did that in the kiln, these seem more likely to maybe trick someone into thinking it could be a secret area. Just be advised that the collision up here isn't completely solid, and you'll fall out of the map if you try walking to the back left corner. Backing things up a little bit, we have this area with the dead dragon. I like seeing what the actual collision looks like, because it reveals much wider invisible ramps surrounding the tail. This allows the player to walk over the tail without getting stuck on it. But you won't actually see the player character go up and down these broader ramps. They'll appear to clip right through them, standing on the visual geometry correctly. This is because a different kind of higher poly collision also blankets the environment, seen in green here. This collision has a variety of purposes, but it's not what we actually stand on or walk into. If only the green collision was here, we would fall out of the map. Even though we appear to be standing on the green instead of the blue collision at the moment, so what's going on? Well, this is because the high poly or green collision is used for our character's inverse kinematics. Basically, even when the green and blue collisions are misaligned a bit, our feet will be pulled towards the green like a magnet, as long as they're not too far apart. This informs our character of how to pose correctly on more detailed parts of the environment, using inverse kinematics to bend our leg joints accordingly. Even though it's not what the player is actually standing on top of, the player character is literally standing on top of the low poly blue collision, even though it really doesn't look like it at the moment. And here we can spot a subtle artifact relating to this. This does affect the camera. The camera is tied to our environmental collision cylinder, which desyncs with our character's model a little bit and raises higher along with the invisible ramp. So while we don't see the character float when stepping onto the invisible ramp, the camera does get lifted. Something else I noticed here was a general lack of invisible walls, which allows for some messing around. While I'm sure a good number of players have tried to get up on the dragon and failed, it is possible if you're persistent enough. Then while you're up here, things are a bit weird because the wings are completely covered over, meaning there's a few places you can stand where you'll appear to be floating. And nearby right over here, the collision matches the height of the railing we see, and sure enough, with enough dedication this allows us to jump onto the railing from the staircase and take an unintended shortcut, a result of the developers not being as hyper-vigilant with railing protection as they probably should have been. Down below, we can demonstrate another purpose of the high poly collisions. While we of course can't walk through here, the high poly collisions matches the shape of the iron bars. High collisions are what our projectiles impact, and so whether or not you can shoot an arrow through something like a set of bars or an open window depends entirely on whether or not there's enough of an opening in the high or green collisions for that. While most of the corridor under the fire-breathing dragon isn't protected, as they didn't care if you went out of your way to make a lethal jump here, there's more railing protection to keep us out of an out-of-bounds area that's off to the side of the stairs. There's a few other small patches of invisible walls around here, but I wanted to point out this little one by the second bonfire. This one is funny because it helps reveal a particular problem that the devs probably initially missed. Most of the environmental collisions we find are divided into discrete chunks of the level. While I could toggle them to display for the entire level at once, this section here is one particular set of collisions. However, a lot of the invisible walls that prevent shenanigans aren't tied to one specific part of the map in the same way. We can often find these in a single set of disconnected collisions that span the entire level, and it's pretty obvious that this is where a lot of the hands-on adjustments to the environmental collisions are made. This one segment here is one of those. It's not part of the same collisions of the rest of the tower we're standing on, so it sticks out as something being tacked on afterwards. We can see that without it there, we likely could have jumped over the wall. And if we could have done that, then we would have been able to land down here. And then we could try dropping into this out of bounds area, but it lacks collision and that wouldn't be great. So finding this little segment here helps reveal a problem spot that the developers had to fix. Speaking of things that apparently needed fixing, there's this shelf below the second bonfire. This is the same as the last thing I just pointed out, it's not part of the rest of the surrounding environmental collision. This one particular support for the shelf was added afterwards too, but I don't know what I'm looking at or why this is here. They didn't do this for any of the other shelves, and the nearby environmental collision already had some collision here too, albeit not as wide without the extra added bit. I don't know if players were maybe getting stuck here without that there, but I don't see how that would be the case. So yeah, I really don't know why they had to add this here, and that's perhaps one of the more curious tweaks to the collisions that I've found. Other evidence of things just not being totally right in this room is that the high poly collisions fully block off some of these shelves. I don't think there's a purpose for this, it's like they accidentally used the shape of low poly collisions here. It would make sense to cover these shelves with invisible walls that stop the player, but there's no need for an invisible wall to stop projectiles, and you usually don't see that done for spaces like this, so it looks like a minor mistake. In my Dark Souls 2 video, I pointed out another spot where high poly collisions erroneously took the shape of low poly collisions. So despite not being a common problem for From Software, we've seen this at least once before. Heading further down, we find that the staircase leading to Greyrat is more enclosed than it appears, so you were never actually at risk of rolling or jumping out of here. Over by the second dead dragon, we have a tall invisible wall blocking it off entirely, so unlike the other one, we can't even begin to attempt climbing on top of it. And to our right, we have another invisible wall, stopping us from jumping down to the top of the staircase corridor to Greyrat. Though I don't really see an issue with landing on top of it, the roof has proper collision and doesn't seem to get us anywhere inappropriate, especially since all the surrounding pitfalls are covered with kill planes. Ones we can still encounter anyways if we just jump over the iron fence below, which wasn't similarly given an invisible wall. The second Pus of Man rooftop has an invisible enemy wall protecting most sides of it, helping prevent using gravity against him. Where perhaps it's placed here with consideration for the Crystal Lizard, to make chasing after it less annoying so it doesn't run off of the roof. If you're thinking that sounds too generous for From Software, I think by Dark Souls 3, they softened their Crystal Lizard design to be not as annoying as it was in Demon Souls. Plus, we will find another example later on of an enemy wall that was added for just a Crystal Lizard. Though I never realized before that this was here and that it also stops other enemies, preventing them from following you if you aggro them. While running past enemies often isn't that difficult, it's sometimes made easier by stuff like this that you might not even be aware of. I should also mention that I once saw the Pus of Man clip through the environment and fall into the room below, so the invisible walls aren't completely foolproof for stopping him from winding up somewhere inappropriate. But I have absolutely no idea how common that is or isn't, so leave a comment if you've seen that before, or maybe even know how to replicate it. As we make our way through this building, we wind up by a staircase that overlooks the Consumed King's Garden. You probably know what to expect by now, it's unsurprising to find railing protection here. But these railings are pretty tall on their own already, and maybe didn't need them, but it's not hard to see why the developers didn't want you getting over it. There's this weird low poly out of bounds area with low res textures that lacks collision. Plus, as I mentioned in my Dark Souls 3 world layout video, the view here is fake. Well, it's only a little fake. The Consumed King's Garden is in that direction, but that tower should be further away from us. This is all just kind of fake nonsense that doesn't look great graphically, so to be extra safe, they covered it up with much taller walls than were probably necessary. Pretty much the entire area between Vort and the Dancer of the Boreal Valley is protected with taller walls. And the foliage is covered with slippery ramps that prevent us from staying on top of them. This is pretty much it for the high wall. I did find it a little interesting that the entrance to Fort's arena got these extra wings of collision. Maybe something about the natural shape of the room was a risk for the player or the boss getting stuck, so perhaps a more severe angle was needed. It's not uncommon to find the perimeter of boss rooms covered with enemy walls to sort of smooth out those rougher edges, but again, this is one that actually blocks the player, so it's a little unusual. Okay, let's make our way to the Undead Settlement. At the start of the Undead Settlement, this sloped surface got an invisible wall blocking it. They wanted to prevent out-of-bounds exploration, but there isn't really anywhere you could go from here anyways. As we make our way beyond the gate, we have this inaccessible area off to our left side. Unsurprisingly, this is covered up with invisible walls as well. Though I didn't previously realize that all of the wooden railings are breakable, which is kind of neat. There's nothing technically interesting about it, but putting breakable objects in unreachable areas is always oddly satisfying to me. It helps the environment feel bigger and a little more alive in a way, if we can still interact with a few things that are out of reach. Something else we find here is how these treetops are wrapped in these bubbles of collision, something that applies to most trees in the area. However, they don't stop our movement, nor the movement of enemies. They're instead here to solely restrict the movement of our camera. They didn't want the camera getting a bunch of branches in the way. which isn't always inherently an issue. A solution we often found for this in Dark Souls 2 was to leave the camera's movement completely unrestricted, but to render these things as objects that become transparent if they get in front of the camera. That's one solution. However, as the Souls games moved beyond the PS3 and Xbox 360 to the next generation of consoles, they tried to take advantage of the increase in power and memory to stuff a bunch more junk into the maps. Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 just have a lot more stuff around compared to the previous games, and since there's already a lot of object files being loaded in the area, it might have been a big ask to render all of the trees as objects as well. It's less taxing for the game to handle them as static elements of the map, so instead of making them objects that can turn transparent for the camera, it was almost certainly less resource demanding to not bother and wrap the trees in bubbles of collisions. Speaking of elements of the environment that are or aren't objects, we can find something very curious as we approach the courtyard. Turning around from here and looking up, it turns out that just the awning of this building is an object file. Meaning if we de-render the map, but continue to render objects like breakable boxes and barrels, we'll see just the awning floating by itself. This is strange because this isn't something we commonly find throughout the area. Granted, the entire distance set piece for the Cathedral of the Deep is also an object, and I talked about why that was likely the case in my world layout video, but for local architecture, there's not a whole lot that remains as objects, and having only one specific part of a building remain as an object like this stands out as a bit weird. In Dark Souls 2, we found evidence of objects being converted into static parts of the map, which was surely part of the optimization process. Earlier in development, it was likely convenient to create more assets as individual objects. Perhaps it was easier to move them around, or simply develop them in isolation first. But once settled into their appropriate place in the map, the objects would sometimes get deleted and replaced with copies that are baked into the map instead as static elements, no different than the rest of the nearby walls and floors around you, explaining why some objects in Dark Souls 2 are breakable in one location and then not in another. This is because where it isn't breakable, it's no longer an object. Finding a few weird objects like this in Dark Souls 3 is probably once again just leftover remnants of an optimization process where they missed a few things. What does any of this have to do with invisible walls? Well, let's go back to the awning. If we toggle its object collision into view, we can see that it doesn't even match the shape of it, being scaled larger in size. So that's more evidence they didn't completely finish whatever was happening here. Because this is all out of reach from the player, it's completely inconsequential, but now that we know it's here, we can hit the misplaced collision with arrows, revealing a very minor, unintentional invisible wall of sorts. We have some very tall railing protection on the railings that are up by Loretta's Bone, really trying to ensure that you only drop off through the designated exit.
Can I jump down there? I don't think so. Jumping over rails seems like it's never a thing you can do.
Of course, you can sometimes jump over railings, but he was completely right to assume he couldn't, as it wasn't even close. Most of the trees in this area don't get invisible walls protecting them, just letting the natural shape of the tree dictate the shape of its collision. However, maybe it has something to do with being a bigger set piece and the flaming corpses at the bottom, but the central tree of the courtyard did get an invisible wall wrapped around it. This bridge to the right of the courtyard was thoroughly protected with invisible walls as well. I'm not entirely sure of the need for this, as there are plenty of cliffs nearby to fall off of, but yeah, for whatever reason the devs didn't want you falling off of the bridge apparently. In the area with the non-hostile cage guy, they didn't surround the cliffside with kill planes, and because you'd have some survivable falls nearby, they put up invisible walls here to help prevent unintended shortcuts. However, the taller part of the cliffside wasn't covered up, and the lack of kill planes meant that the developers were relying on the height of the fall being lethal. And there are glitches for avoiding fall damage, so speedrunners take advantage of this. I also find it interesting that there isn't anything special happening with the collisions by the corpse carrying the flame stone plate ring. What I mean is that this almost feels like a scripted event. The developers obviously wanted to bait you with an item that gets knocked off of the cliff, forcing you to collect it from below later on. But there isn't anything here that really ensures that, beyond putting it very close to the edge, and simply letting the natural shape of the environment and the ragdoll physics of the corpse do its thing. So you might be thinking, big deal, so they put a thing next to a cliff so it easily falls off of the cliff. And yeah, totally, I get it, but you can get on the opposite side of it to hit it in the opposite direction. And while this sometimes lands the corpse safely up here, it still very often manages to find its way off of the cliff anyways. So the placement feels impeccable to me. It's a perfectly executed bait that has zero guardrails, no special collisions funneling it to ensure any specific outcome. They just let the ragdoll physics take the lead here, and much more often than not, the player usually still gets trolled even when they try their best to be careful. Also not really having anything to do with invisible walls, but I wanted to take a moment to appreciate these chandeliers being objects that have pushable collision, just like the hanging corpses. They're out of reach from the player, so they're not something you're going to interact with, but they did place one of these so that it gets hit by an enemy when it drops from the ceiling, which is a nice touch in adding a dynamic element to the environment. I find it neat that they went out of their way to do that, and we can forgive this first one for not being attached to anything and just floating there. On the walkway leading to Cornyx, overlooking the exploding barrels area, there's these rooftops off to the side that they didn't want you getting on top of, so they covered them up with an invisible wall. In the area where the giant shoots at us, there's a bunch more invisible walls helping protect trees and tombstone mounds, as well as some out-of-bounds areas they didn't intend for us to explore. The left side of the staircase to the curse-rotted Greatwood is covered up as well. There's this whole out-of-bounds area over here they didn't want you trying to explore, because it lacks collision and you would just fall out of the map if you made it there. The curse-rotted Greatwood boss room has the trees in its corners covered up, and the bottom of the arena is wrapped with a shell that creates some space from the outer walls. They didn't want you or the boss getting stuck on any of this. Over here, we have a spot that probably could have used an invisible wall. The collision just matched the environment that you see a little too closely, which allows us to get up to a small spot that we weren't meant to. While this isn't a big deal, as it doesn't lead to anything bad happening for the player, you could hide from invaders here as well, and it's not very good for the multiplayer experience to have out-of-bounds areas accessible. I learned about this spot from a series of videos made by Jelly Elite, which will be linked in the video description below. But nearby over here, they did remember to put invisible walls around both sides of this area, as they didn't want you getting on top of the out-of-bounds rooftops that straddled the valley underneath them. Moving on to the church, the entrance has these wings protecting its sides. An invisible enemy wall up top prevents the giant from following you down the stairs if you aggro it. Not that fighting him is particularly difficult if you're a monster, but this can be easily exploited since there isn't enough room for him to walk around this, causing him to get stuck here when he tries going after you. And the secret upper exit by Siegfried gets these two small flaps which prevent following the perimeter of the building exit. If these weren't here, we'd be able to walk around a pretty nifty out-of-bounds area with a great view. Though of course they didn't want us trying to jump down to terrain that wasn't built for exploration. And on the opposite side, a pitfall without a kill plane is protected. This area down by the fire demon is surrounded with invisible enemy walls, to help prevent it from falling off of a cliff, as well as getting stuck under this overhang. These walls also protect and restrict Siegfried's movement as well. Back here they didn't include an invisible wall when they should have. They relied on this gap here being too small for the player to fit through, and while it's very difficult to fit through here, it is possible with enough persistence, giving us a good visualization of the smallest gap we can possibly fit through. This can be a problem spot because getting back out may prove equally difficult. We also find that this tree's collision is misplaced and doesn't match the tree we see. If the collision reveals its original placement, it's easy to see why they moved it. It would have been further off to the side and less visible from here, so they moved it to a spot where it does a better job of filling out this otherwise empty, out-of-bounds spot. Of course, I'm going to suggest this as another spot that we tag with an illusory wall message. Something else we find in this area is more camera collision that floats a little bit above the ground. That means you can't angle a camera as low as you normally can, which is a little unusual, but I can see what they were going for. This is standard practice in any location where your feet are supposed to sink below the surface a little, as they don't want the camera to be able to go underneath the water or swamp line. On normal ground you don't find this very often, but I suspect that in the process of wrapping all the trees in camera collision, some devs overlooking the area just kind of ran with it and tried to protect mostly anything that might be annoying for the camera. They didn't do it by the entrance of the level, and without the camera collision to help, it's not hard to angle the camera down and get grass in front of it. It's not a significant issue, because you still pretty much have to go out of your way to get that angle, but at the same time, it's also not inherently a bad idea to try and stop that from happening. They put this sort of anti-grass, ground-level camera collision over the starting bridge, over pretty much the entire left side of the level, and also in this area by the fire demon to help keep grass out of the camera. And they also covered most of the wooden rooftops in this area as well, perhaps to prevent any issues with uneven boards potentially clipping into the camera space. As I repeatedly stress that the high poly collisions for inverse kinematics and projectiles do a much better job of matching what we see, it's not always perfect. There are some misaligned rocks over here, as well as a broken beam with collision that's taller and has more to it. These are hardly a significant issue, but if you ever find your arrows getting stuck somewhere weird mid-air, something like this is probably to blame. While the Souls games are generally pretty good at avoiding obvious invisible walls that you can easily notice without doing weird jumps, the underside of this staircase on the roof clearly has enough room for the player to fit, while it's just completely walled off. Not letting us go underneath is still a good idea, because who knows what unintended outcome may happen from trying to squeeze underneath a ramp of collision. But since we're here to overanalyze the implementation of invisible walls, I think a better way of handling this would have been to lower this wooden beam to make it more intuitive that we can't squeeze under there. And I would have opened this up to let the player go underneath the stairs, and instead put another invisible wall under here, blocking movement in this direction, to avoid allowing us to get too close to the ramp underside. This would open up the space to avoid having obvious invisible walls, and you could even use this space to have like an item corpse back there or something. I also found this little rooftop off to the side interesting. There's nothing down here, so I was wondering why it wasn't blocked off, but taking a closer look made me realize that there's a minor alternate path to the Claranthe Ring Tower that I've never taken before. While the vast majority of players likely go this way to get down there, you could drop down from this side and go this way instead. Or you could also turn around to drop back down into the courtyard if you wanted to go back and maybe collect some stuff you missed. I think this is generally good level design. It really doesn't change anything, but allowing for minor deviations in routing is good for making you feel like there's room to explore, and that you're not as bottlenecked as you really are. Although something about this area felt a little off and underbaked to me, and taking a closer look revealed a surprising number of reasons that validated my suspicions. This rooftop is lower poly and smoother than the other wooden rooftops, so has the vibe of an out-of-bounds platform you're not supposed to land on. The high poly collisions don't perfectly match this rooftop, so it's easy to see yourself floating above it on one side, or have your feet sink into it on the other side. None of this stuff sticking out of the roof has collisions, so you can just walk through all of it, including this wooden beam over here. Additionally, the intended route has nav meshes connecting the expected drop-down paths, but none follow us onto these other rooftops. And this side of this roof isn't covered with a nav mesh at all. And this entire side roof doesn't have a nav mesh either. If you don't know what a nav mesh is, that's short for navigation mesh, and it's what allows enemy and NPC AI to make decisions on how to navigate the environment. Without this blanketing all walkable parts of the map, enemies don't know where they can walk to. Even when there aren't any enemies nearby, the maps are just covered with this stuff by default, because if you only place them where you think enemies might go, that creates all sorts of potential issues, especially when enemies get moved around later in development. So to err on the side of caution, literally any traversable part of the map should be covered in this stuff. Finding spots like this without nav meshes is incredibly rare, which all points to this area being quasi out of bounds, like an unfinished side area that wasn't problematic enough to need to be fixed any further, but all of this I think justifies my surprise and gut feeling that this should have been blocked off with an invisible wall. While we're straying a bit from the topic and just looking at how weird this area is, one last thing I'd like to point out is this really strange glitch with the collisions when dropping off from this ledge. If you land on top of this railing, which would be my natural inclination to reduce fall damage, you'll find that you won't take any fall damage at all. That is, until you step off of the railing, where the fall damage finally triggers. This means that you can take what should be a lethal fall from higher up, temporarily survive, and even do stuff in between like roll, backstep, attack, use consumables, etc., only to finally die once you step down from the railing. While this is a fairly obscure glitch in Dark Souls 3, where I'm not sure of the exact cause, it's surely a precursor to something a lot more annoying that more players have experienced, which is dying from awkwardly short falls when riding Torrent in Elden Ring. This is the result of slippery surfaces allowing the fall damage to build up. The game never treats you as having landed on solid ground, despite being able to jump off of it, so it feels extremely glitchy and unintuitive. But this railing here is pretty wide and very obviously flat, so it's even harder to comprehend here. How can this happen with a surface that isn't sloped or slippery in some way? I suspect that in some way, maybe it sort of technically is. I noticed that this other railing above does have sloped surfaces on top of it. You'll slide off of this one. If the railing below was some modified copy-paste job of the railing above, that somehow accidentally flattened the slopes into being perfectly horizontal, maybe that's how we wound up with something like this. Maybe it's a flat piece of collision with a sloped surface property left toggled on by accident. Just a guess, but this goes a level deeper into analyzing the collision data than I'm capable of. I wouldn't even know where to begin probing for answers in either debug or map editor like Smithbox, so if any Dark Souls 3 modders have a better understanding of what's going on here, please leave a comment, I'd love to know. Moving on to the Road of Sacrifices and the Farron Keep, these areas are almost completely devoid of invisible walls, at least compared to everything else we've seen so far. The level geometry is a lot simpler overall, so the natural shape of the environment generally keeps us in bounds, while a greater lack of vertical level design means less worrying about weird shortcuts and stuff like that. For the most part, what you see is what you get. While a lot of the outer rock walls might have collisions that are very simplified compared to how the rocks appear, and the lack of having collision on top really clarifies how simple of a wall is actually here, I still wouldn't call this an invisible wall. It matches the rocks a little too closely. We can see what stops our movement well enough. There are a few more deliberately protected rocks and trees, but most aren't, and the default shape of the tree's collisions usually aren't a problem. Perhaps the most meaningful and important invisible wall to be found here is the railing protection found in this area out back that overlooks the Farron Keep swamp below. While railing protection is common, they didn't just mindlessly place them along all of the railings back here, and where they do and don't show up reveals a very conscious reasoning from the developers. Before we make it past the other side of the shortcut, all of the railings are protected, since they didn't want you dropping into the Farron Keep in an unintended way. However, once you cross through the shortcut doorway, none of the railings on the side get extra protection. Their collision instead matches the visible height of the railing. That's because you've already traversed through the Farron Keep to get here, and there are some spots with intended drops down from here, albeit not over the railings directly, but it's clear the developers stopped caring about the railings on the side of the path, which makes perfect sense given the route you had to take to get here. Not really relating to invisible walls, but in regards to weird stuff in general with collisions here, I did want to point out the spot by the top of the ladder to the Farron Keep. There's a bit of buggy collision where they didn't set the draw groups properly, making a lot of the environment around you disappear when you touch it. If you're not familiar with what a draw group is, where you stand at any given moment determines what's visible. And while that may seem obvious, it shouldn't be confused with draw distance, because that's not what draw groups are. Sure, certain visual elements in these games may be culled or simplified by draw distance, like if something is too far away it stops rendering, but that's not how most of the environment works. Rather than using raw distance from the player or camera to determine that sort of thing, every piece of ground that you stand on has a list of what other parts of the map to render, so you have something more like an arbitrary checklist of things to display, or in other words, a draw group. This is why if I fly somewhere far away, distant parts of the map don't start displaying for us, because simply getting close to a further part of the map isn't enough to tell the game to show it to us. It's not until we touch a closer collision that we see an update, because that piece of ground will have a different list of which parts of the map to render. When I first saw this glitch, I assumed it was something like the collision of the other side of the walkway poking through, and getting its draw groups to display, because that could maybe explain why the room we're in disappears, if we're not meant to see it from the other side. But that's not what's happening. This spot here doesn't match the draw groups of any other inbounds location in the entire level. Standing in any of the spots it makes visible would still require displaying a lot more of the level, but almost everything de-renders from here. Very few elements of the level remain when standing on the spot, so the draw group found here is a unique one that doesn't make sense in any part of the level. As for the Crystal Sage's arena, this is one spot where they maybe could have been more aggressive with invisible walls. While there's decent enough protection for the rock walls up here, there's actually a way to skip the boss fight by climbing some terrain by the exit fog gate. However, not covering this up better isn't a very big deal, because it's pretty difficult to do and isn't something most players would ever consider. I spent quite a while trying to pull this off. But it is possible, and I have to give credit to a recent video by Splee5556 that brought this to my attention. I'll link to his demonstration in the video description below. Moving down into the Farron Keep, there's an invisible wall on this path to help prevent you from falling into this side of the tower. If you could fall back here, you'd get stuck in the spot behind the Nameless Knight set. And turning around from here, further back down the stairs I found this weird invisible flap on the railing. I couldn't think of a reason why there'd be a tiny bit of railing protection when the rest of it is unprotected, and we're near ground level and there's nothing of concern on the opposite side. As it turns out, this tiny segment of invisible wall does appear to be a mistake, especially when we consider how standing on top of it accidentally triggers poison buildup like the swamp below. So clearly something isn't right here. The The sides of most of these walkways don't seem to need invisible walls at first. They're quite blocky and usually tall enough to stop the player, which is why I was surprised to see a speedrunner just run right over this. Toggling the collisions into view reveals that this one segment wasn't too severe of an angle and that it ramps all the way down to the ground. This is why invisible walls are largely a good idea to help support level geometry like this, though it's good for speedrunning that one wasn't included here specifically. Very shortly after turning around, I was able to find another spot like this, now that I knew what to look for. And there probably should have been an invisible wall here, because you can get stuck. There's also another out-of-bounds hiding spot that's made accessible by the fact that they didn't line these walkways with railing protection. Here I'd like seeing what the low-poly version of the Old Wolf's collision looks like. We can see how they clearly started with something that matched the model more accurately, with details like this ear sticking out, as well as these paws below. And clipping the camera through confirms that the original shape of the wolf is underneath this stuff, but of course they covered it all up with bigger, blockier collisions to make it harder to climb him. Though I did notice that his tail ramped down very close to the ground, and sure enough it is a spot you can still use to get on top. But the overall blockiness still serves a purpose, even if it wasn't foolproof in keeping us off, because getting on top is likely less of a problem now, where various gaps and nooks without the extra covering could have been a hazard for getting the player stuck, so they did avoid that. Up on the Farron Keep side of the broken bridge pointing towards the Undead Settlement, there's a couple small invisible walls that keep us from traversing the rubble too close to the end of the bridge. I find it funny that if we could get to the other side, a massive invisible wall would stop us from moving further towards the Undead Settlement, but it was completely unnecessary. If you're wondering how there can be an invisible wall here that doesn't impede our movement when we're actually in the Undead Settlement, it's because this isn't really part of the Undead Settlement's map. It's not that this view is a lie, exactly. If you haven't watched my video on the world layout of Dark Souls 3, or you could use a reminder, the spatial accuracy here is correct. If you ever wondered if they're playing any tricks here or if this view makes sense, this is exactly where the Undead Settlement should be. So while they didn't really fake this view, because of the very roundabout level progression to actually get from the Undead Settlement all the way to over here, it wouldn't make any sense to have to load any of the Undead Settlement's actual map. Why bother loading an entire different level from the one we're in if we can't walk back and forth between them? So to avoid having to do that, what we have here is a copy and paste job of simplified parts of the Undead Settlement into the Farron Keep's map, aligned to where it should be in terms of the game's global XYZ coordinates. So because this isn't the full and proper Undead Settlement's map, nor was the game designed to be able to transition loading into that area from over here, it was never going to be possible to somehow jump across the gap and wind up back in the Undead Settlement. What I find neat about this is how the copy and paste nature of the different vantage points means that the opposite sides of the bridge can deviate in subtle ways, since development would have continued beyond the initial implementation of this view. For example, the real version of the Farron Keep has this side on the left very broken down so you can't traverse all the way to the end of the broken bridge on the upper level, but in how it's conveyed from the Undead Settlement side, it appears much more intact, like you'd be able to walk all the way to the broken part of the bridge on the upper level. Does this mean that an earlier version of the bridge looked like this and had the space fully walkable? Not necessarily, it just used to be blocked in a different way, and we have evidence of this hiding in the collision data. From the Undead Settlement map, toggling into view the copy-pasted version of the Farron Keep's high-poly collision reveals a couple broken towers that don't exist anymore. This would have blocked the path up here, but now it doesn't exist in either version of the map, with the only remaining evidence being in the Undead Settlement's high collision data. Well, maybe not the only remaining evidence. Something else we can see from the Undead Settlement side is shorter versions of the broken towers. Instead of extending all the way up here, they shorten the rubble to end up down here instead. And these are visible without going out of bounds or getting anywhere too weird. But from the actual Farron Keep map, not even the base of these ruined towers exist, at all. So we can see how the design iterated here. Taller broken towers that protruded into the playable game space, ones that were shortened to be out of bounds off to the side, and then they were just taken away entirely. This was a bit of a tangent here, but consider this a follow-up to my previous video. It's a good lesson on how distant views of other areas may not be totally accurate, while the overall spatial accuracy in terms of level placement can still be spot on. And here we have some evidence in the collision data of how the design evolved. Moving over to the Stray Demon side of the bridge, while they were okay with most of the railings matching how they appear, segments closer to the rubble piles got railing protection to help keep us in bounds, and the rubble piles themselves got even taller invisible walls. The Stray Demon also has invisible enemy walls lining his arena. And speaking of enemy walls, there's an exploitable one found at the area transition between the Road of Sacrifices and the Cathedral of the Deep. This means you can pull the nearby NPCs towards the bridge and they can't follow you on, so you can enjoy some cheesy kills here. I wonder if this is why they gave both of them throwing knives, so they at least have some attacks that can get through. For some players, this might not make the exploitability of the invisible wall as immediately obvious, since it's not 100% foolproof. Of course, it could just be a complete coincidence, but I'm starting to suspect that giving enemies who are near enemy walls ranged attacks might be a conscious design choice. The entrance to the Cathedral of the Deep has a lot of deliberate and tall invisible walls protecting the treeline and rock wall perimeters, aside from this one spot here that was left wide open. It was left wide open because in an area that's otherwise extremely dense with foliage and doesn't let you see the sky pretty much at all, they wanted to give us one more spot where we could look back and see Lothric Castle looming above us, as well as some of the Road of Sacrifices and Farron Keep in the distance. I talked about this in my last video, but it doesn't hurt to point out again that Dark Souls 3 is really good at frequently showing upcoming or previous locations, which goes a long way in making the world feel cohesive. And this is a good thing, because exploration is more interesting when it has a context to it, and views like this reinforce the spatial context of where you are. And that's the entire purpose of this location. There's a cliff we can fall off of, but the lack of invisible walls doesn't mean that it was put here as a hazard. There aren't any enemies up here that might cause you to panic roll, and there aren't any precariously placed items. It's an empty landing made entirely for the view. Just look up at the castle and maybe don't take too close of a look down below, especially not in a high resolution with depth of field turned off. We got some Z-fighting textures over by the entrance to the Crystal Sage, mesh gap here, and some ugly low poly set pieces, and we can also spot a textureless backside to the Farron Keep's perimeter wall. I'm not saying the view is perfect in terms of graphical fidelity, but it makes me respect putting these distant views in because it's a big risk and a ton of work. It has no bearing on the moment-to-moment gameplay, which is what most people care about on the surface, but vibes are cool and they matter. In the next area leading towards the Cathedral, the low poly collision of the environment and lack of taller invisible walls creates an issue where it's very easy to jump over this gap and get out of bounds. We can drop somewhere behind to get an undignified look at a very low poly and incomplete version of the Undead Settlement, which is coming back into view for later in the level where the giant can shoot at the enemies near us. Things like the tombstones get invisible walls thoroughly wrapping them, getting the same treatment that things like stalagmites always do in these games. And further into the cemetery, taller walls help protect parts of the outer walls of the path. I did find this one spot that looked a little more open, with some tombstones that I kind of hoped could act as stepping stones for getting out of bounds. But I found another issue here. Trying to jump from here makes it very easy to get stuck in a falling animation. This is why it's important to cover up level geometry like this with invisible walls. And it's funny considering how it's clearly the norm elsewhere in the level. It's another good example of how not being consistent with invisible walls usually gets them into a bit of trouble. We found a bunch of that in Dark Souls 1. Getting stuck in a falling animation like this is lethal after 12 seconds. Dark Souls 3 was their first game to significantly shorten the wait for this, as in previous games, including Bloodborne, that wait was a full 30 seconds instead. And something new in Dark Souls 3, it also depends on how you get stuck falling. It takes a full 12 seconds when you get stuck and hover in place like this. But if the reason you get stuck falling is because you fell out of bounds somewhere and you missed a kill plane, the game appears to stack on an additional height comparison check, where the game is actually aware that you're falling a long distance and not just hovering in place, and the wait time to be killed for falling too long that way is shortened to a very quick 3.5 seconds or so. This makes falling out of bounds without hitting a kill plane not a big deal here, aside from likely seeing some jank for a brief moment. This makes it a far cry from how it used to be, where it felt like it took forever to die. And they seem to be happy with this newer system, or at least they're aware it's a significant improvement, because Elden Ring went on to keep this exactly the same. As we make our way onto the rooftops, we find this little patch here that was covered up. While the gap here would have been too small for the player to fit through anyways, it might have been a weird spot sandwiched between the sconce on the wall, so an invisible wall was put here to cover both the gap and the entire sconce. I also found this spot interesting. While perhaps not completely invisible, because it represents the tree branches seen here, the collision reveals just how solid and broad the wall covering it actually is. While getting beyond it would be a lethal fall regardless, without glitches of course, that far side of the invisible wall does lack a kill plane, while the side closer to us has one. I can't see any obvious reason why the kill plane couldn't have extended farther in that direction, but putting an obstacle here that funnels us towards it also works. Regardless, the tree was likely put here to help create some visual noise to deter players from considering this as a viable drop-down path, and its wall of collision was to help ensure that players couldn't figure out a way to make that work. It's not surprising that they would be on guard about this, because of all the places they might be on the lookout for unintended shortcuts, ones that would land you immediately on the opposite side of a shortcut gate seem pretty obvious. This area down here at the bottom of the level gets tall invisible walls protecting the landslide rocks and the staircase railings. And the large shrine outside the Deacons of Deep boss room was completely walled off as well. Aside from a bit of railing protection on a few other staircases here, that's all I could find for the Cathedral of the Deep. When you have rooftops surrounded by pitfalls where the developers didn't care if you fell into them, as well as interior locations with fairly simple geometry, it's a recipe for allowing the low poly collision to just match what you see pretty well, and not needing to bother with many invisible walls. I did like how the high poly collisions looked for these statues in the Deacon's boss room. They're a little misaligned, which I don't find particularly interesting, but I don't know, this just kind of looks cool. This would make for a fun screenshot without any context. I would also like to point out that, like the chandeliers we saw earlier, these weird baby cradles suspended from the ceiling in Rosaria's bedchamber were also given physics with their object collision. So we don't normally get to see them in full swing, but using debug to fly around and hit all of them looks pretty funny. Moving on to the Catacombs and Demon Ruins, there aren't many invisible walls here either, so we're going to get through it all pretty quickly. Shortly after the first Necromancer, the railings down here got a little bit of extra railing protection. The railings on the opposite side didn't get the same treatment, because jumping over this railing would be a shortcut that takes us further into the level, while jumping over the other railings wouldn't be. So the slightly taller railing is evidence of the developers being concerned about skipping the intended level progression. But since railing protection is usually at least a little taller than this, it makes me wonder why they didn't make this a couple feet taller as well. An unintended outcome of making this invisible wall so short is that speedrunners managed to find a way over it, by walking awkwardly into the side of this pot. This shortcut is known as the fence skip, but it's a lot harder to pull off than it looks, and is a pretty notorious obstacle in speedruns. Sometimes I get this fairly quickly, but I'm having a really hard time getting it consistent, and it's not uncommon for me to do this for minutes without any luck. What does the collision data help inform us about the fence skip? I have no idea. For anyone who ever struggled with this, perhaps seeing everything visualized as collisions will be nice, but as far as I can tell, we're really just stretching the absolute limits of the maximum height and angle we can possibly step onto, so it doesn't look particularly feasible with the collisions enabled either. So what have we learned here? Absolutely nothing. Later in the level, we find our typical stalagmite protection. Sometimes they have invisible walls surrounding them, sometimes they're completely enclosed even on top. But here's a spot where they didn't block them off well enough, allowing you to get behind them.
Colonel, do you read me? I think I'm in Dark Souls 3.
Here's a look at the object collision for the collapsible bridge. I don't really have anything to say about it, but there's something kind of neat about seeing it collapse this way. And here's a look at Wolnir's boss room. It's pretty dark in here, so it can be a little hectic and hard to notice how the boundaries are conveyed to us, but you do run into this vaguely dense grass on the sides, which is where massive invisible walls box us in. A look with the collisions toggled on and free cam makes it easier to see how the start of the thicker grass is treated as our obstacle. When we get down to the fire demon, we find some invisible enemy walls that act as ramps that stick out from the ledges. The developers were likely worried about the demon getting stuck in these nooks if it hugged the wall too closely when dropping down, so the ramps create some extra distance to avoid that. Moving down into the Smouldering Lake and Demon Ruins, there's not really much to point out. The interior of the Demon Ruins, like most of the Catacombs, has fairly simple level geometry without a need for invisible walls. Up in the Smouldering Lake, we do find the usual invisible walls that we typically expect to line the rocky walls like this, but that's pretty much it. I suppose I could also point out that the cave pathway to the area with Hollowed Horus is more narrow than it appears in places. Though there are some very strange enemy walls in the Smouldering Lake. There's a massive one floating above it. It's high enough above the ground that it doesn't come close to restricting the movement of the crabs, so it's obviously not for them. What could such a large enemy wall even be for in the first place? What could potentially be stopped by something this high off of the ground? Well, clearly, it has to be the Karthus sandworm. But like, why? The sandworm's movement is tightly scripted to only move around this one particular area. It won't follow you out to this part of the lake. So it makes me wonder if the original intention was for it to track your movement better when it goes underground, instead of waiting in just one spot. Something funny about this invisible enemy wall is that it clips into the cliffside with the giant arrow mechanism, and it creates a short wall that blocks enemies up here too. I don't know how useful this is as an exploit. If you're someone who's going to run past enemies, it's not too hard to do that, pull the lever and then bone out, or use the drop-down paths to get out of here. But if you wanted to kill these enemies, consider hugging the cliffside of the giant mechanism, and not far around the corner, you'll find the spot where the enemies get stuck. I feel like somebody has probably noticed this before, but likely assumed it was a leash point in the enemy's AI. But it's funnier than that, because they were programmed to be able to follow you this far, and instead it's an invisible wall stopping them in their tracks, one that didn't need to be here at all. That's not the only confusing enemy wall down here either. The Old Demon King's arena got one surrounding it as well. While it's pretty standard to protect boss arenas with them, this one is a bit weird because it couldn't possibly work. It's further out than the actual playable space, which already has walls down there for both the player and the enemy. And being further out up here, without collision on the ground to connect to it, is completely pointless. This can't help keep an enemy in bounds if they would just fall through the floor anyways. That's really all I could find. I wasn't surprised to see the Taurus demons in the environment get the old wolf treatment, with big blocky collisions that generally prevent us from climbing on top of them. Though I did find one spot where you can get on top. And, anyways, let's make our way to Irithyll and Anor Londo. Immediately by the entrance of Irithyll, invisible walls prevent us from climbing around on the rocks, particularly to the left of the staircase. The opening bridge is protected with two sets of invisible walls, one for the player and a larger one for the enemy. But what's funny about this is that enemy walls were also included in the area below, where you can run into Sullivan's Beast a second time if you don't kill him on the bridge. Enemy walls were put along the cliff to help protect him, but they were a double-edged sword in that they put another flap over here for some reason, creating a cheese opportunity. I've seen people suggest baiting him to a nook down here if you want to cheese him, but there's a much better spot here behind this enemy wall. A wide open path for the player that the enemy can't reach you on. Further into the level, staircases have the usual railing protection, but most railings collisions are exactly what you see unless they're next to a staircase. Though I did find this one extra flap here, which seems to have been placed with consideration that jumping out of bounds beyond it would have the player fall out of the map without collisions or a kill plane. I should also note that despite the railing protection, speedrunners still managed to find a way over the railing here. I don't think it's a major oversight, because I find the jump to be incredibly difficult, but then again, it looks relatively consistent for speedrunners, so I don't know if they're just built different or I'm just bad. I'll link to a video by Matt Apocalypse that explains how to pull it off. Once you get over the railing, this route only works because there's a couple long flat sheets of out-of-bounds collision, a floor that shouldn't be here. This is relatively uncommon. Sure, you can sometimes find spots in the maps like this, where you get out of bounds and kind of walk underneath the level. I'm not saying this never happens, but if you had to gamble on whether or not there's going to be something safe to walk along when going this far out of bounds, I would bet against it because you're much more likely to have nothing to stand on and just fall out of the map. So it was very fortunate for speedrunners to have these collisions here. Here's a snowy nook between some buildings, and what the blocked off pathway actually looks like. In this side area with the Undead Bone Shard, I noticed that one almost reachable out of bounds area off to the left has collisions that match the visual geometry fairly well, but there's an additional layer of collision on top of it that's a little broader and simpler. I wonder if there was an issue with getting out of bounds here, and instead of changing the existing collision, if they perhaps added another one on top that was more consistent at having the player slide off of it, maybe? Regardless of the actual reason, I find myself speculating on this possibility only because it's not very common to find an additional layer of collision stacked a little bit above like this. The outside waterway area has more of the usual protection against rock walls to help make sure you can't climb the rocks out. In the painting room, taller invisible walls protect one set of railings by the chests. At first, this seemed pointless to me, because none of the other railings in here get the same protection, and getting over any of them would all lead to the same place, a location you can very easily get to from nearby stairs. There would be no reason to stop you from jumping over this particular set of railings. And there isn't, but that's not why that's here. Enemies can't see through invisible walls, at least not the kind that stop the player. So the developers were just feeling generous here and protecting you from the Silver Knight Archer when you go to interact with the chests, who would see you if this invisible wall wasn't here. Or perhaps it wasn't generosity as much as it was making the enemy a more consistent threat, because even if it did see you, its shots are just going to hit the chandelier anyways. So maybe this wasn't an act of kindness to the player, as much as it was just about making the Silver Knight not look like a dumbass. There's also something else very weird in here. Over by these frost vases, there's a really weird glitch that can happen. A user on Reddit recently shared a video of them getting stuck between some invisible walls after rolling through them, which was incredibly strange to me, because not only can you obviously walk through here normally, but I'd already done a pass through the area with the collisions toggled on and I didn't see anything out of place. So what did I miss? Well, it turns out that there's a strange bug with these objects. When you break them, an invisible floor appears underneath them for maybe only a couple frames or so. Here's another look in slow motion. Dropoff speculates that maybe From Software made a floor for these so that when testing these objects out of the context of an actual level, that the broken pieces of the vase would have something to land on and interact with. And then perhaps they messed up fully taking it away, which is how we wind up with an object with a test floor that shouldn't be there. In this one that I just showed, it can't create any invisible walls for the player because of how it appears underneath its base. It's clipped a little bit underneath the floor, so it briefly appears somewhere where we can't interact with it. I had to de-render the map to even show it, otherwise it would just be underneath the floor and you wouldn't even be able to see it. However, these other vases here are rotated, which means its entire base rotates with it. It's part of the same object after all. This creates some invisible walls for a split second. If these floors, or walls, are only supposed to last a split second, why are some players getting stuck here? That I'm not as certain of, but I have a guess. You know how you can move broken objects around until they settle? That is, they're movable for a little bit, but eventually wind up somewhere where you can no longer push them around. If that were to play out normally with these broken vases, these weird planes of collision should only flash in and out of existence very briefly. But sometimes the physics of broken objects behaves strangely, and they don't always easily settle, and might do weird stuff like get stuck in a movable state, or like a part of it will just keep rotating forever. I think some kind of similarly weird interaction with these temporary floors is causing them to get stuck in a state that's normally only supposed to last very briefly, occasionally preventing them from disappearing. But I haven't been able to replicate that or get stuck here myself, so let me know in the comments if this has happened to you, or if you know of a consistent setup that causes it to always happen. What's funny is that they actually made this mistake with a few objects. A table that's found in the Dragon Barracks, Cathedral of the Deep, and the Painted World exhibits the same property. But as far as I can tell, all tables are always standing upright, which makes sense, so the weird collision flashes in and out of existence underneath the floor, so you'd never be aware of it, just like I pointed out a moment ago. However, this property does apply to another vase that's found in Irithyll Dungeon, and some of those are rotated, so the same issue with glitchy invisible walls should theoretically be possible with them as well. So if you ever found yourself getting stuck somewhere that wasn't even out of bounds or anywhere overtly weird in Irithyll or Irithyll Dungeon, a vase with what was supposed to be a temporary floor underneath it is probably to blame. Now, way back near the start of the video, I talked about how death cam planes not aligning with the kill planes can occasionally create situations where you can trigger the death cam without dying. Over here is a perfect example. While the kill plane is down here, the death cam plane is up here, and it extends over the playable game space instead of only being aligned directly above the pitfall for some reason. Now, it is high enough above us that we won't just walk into it, so virtually nobody will ever be aware of the poorly implemented thing floating right above them. But this raises the question, is there somewhere we can jump through this and still land in bounds? And sure enough, there's nothing to stop us from doing this. What's funny about this to me is that I didn't know about this before working on this video. It's not like I came here looking for an explanation on this deathcam plane or knew that it could be interacted with. It just looked really wrong to me when I spotted it floating above an inbounds location, so when I wondered if it could be interacted with, I just looked for higher ground and it took me like 2 seconds to figure out walking onto the railing and jumping off from it. So it seems like it should have been easy for the developers to spot, but it's not exactly a big issue. Practically no one is going to attempt the railing jump in a casual playthrough, because what would be the point? That's backtracking, not a shortcut after all. Plus, they've done a lot worse. But this serves as a reminder of how the developers need to be really considerate of kill plane and deathcam placement at all times. An invisible enemy wall in the courtyard after Pontiff stops the giants from following you up the stairs, but not smaller enemies because of the way it's lifted up off the ground. The placement of this almost appears redundant, as the giants also have AI that tell them to turn around and go back to their starting position when you go up the stairs a bit. But there is a sweet spot where you can keep them close and aggroed for cheesing purposes. This floating invisible wall strategy is an interesting pivot from Dark Souls 2, by the way. You might remember this from my Dark Souls 2 Invisible Walls video. Invisible enemy walls in that game were customized to allow certain enemies through, but not all enemies. So they could have a greater control over how that worked, which itself was a change from Dark Souls 1, where, as far as I can tell, all enemy walls stopped all enemies. Dark Souls 3 appears to have reverted back to the technology of Dark Souls 1 in this regard, but the trick up their sleeve this time was to simply place the enemy walls with consideration for the size of the enemy. When they don't want a bigger enemy following you somewhere or falling off of a cliff, but they're okay with smaller mobs doing that, simply lifting the invisible enemy walls off of the ground gives room for smaller enemies to sneak through. I think it's an interesting design evolution, where they continued to use the more limited tech of Dark Souls 1 enemy walls, while still figuring out a way to only let certain enemies pass. Here's another enemy wall that I didn't know existed, but probably won't be news to a fair number of players. There's one stopping the Silver Knights from following you into the Darkmoon Tomb, and I had no idea about this because I'm realizing now that I usually fight all of them before progressing. But for players who do routinely run past enemies, I have a feeling a fair amount of them already know about this. And if you didn't, well, at least you now have a very specific goal of where to run to, where you know you can relax and stop running once you get there. As we make our way to Anor Londo, we can take a look at the invisible walkway that takes us to Yorshka. If you've ever walked across this feeling a little cautious or uneasy about walking across a bridge you can't see, fear not, it's From Software's most generous invisible walkway. It's surrounded by walls on all sides, so you can't possibly fall to your death. Unless you do like a really stupid jump from here. I've always had mixed feelings about this. While I realized they weren't going for a full Crystal Cave experience, I think this is almost too kind. Once you know there's an invisible walkway here, the path to the tower is so straightforward that it's very unlikely that anyone would fall to their deaths without the guardrails. It also lessens the importance of something like Prism Stones, when they're not doing anything to help you from falling to your death. And I realize it's not that they're completely useless here. They were certainly the item that helped a lot of players test if there was a walkway in the first place, but niche items should be given their moment to shine, and they just feel a little less special here. So I give some credit to Elden Ring for not checking it out with its invisible walkways. Tall invisible enemy walls protect the staircase in Anor Londo. I'm not sure if this was totally necessary. If you could bait some of the Silver Knights into falling off, I don't see the big deal. But it is interesting to see this consideration, because the Anor Londo of Dark Souls 1 had fences lining the staircase, so they didn't have to worry about that. In Dark Souls 3, they don't care if the player falls off since they took the fence away, which is fine, but it is interesting to see how they decided to thoroughly protect the enemies here. And once again, there's room for exploitation since the enemy wall blocks the path to the rotating bridge, so this is a great option for cheesing the Silver Knights with ranged attacks, if you're a coward. Also, Dark Souls 3 did keep the railing protection by the bottom of the stairs, so you similarly can't jump over the railing right here, which is silly since that made sense in Dark Souls 1, but not here without the fence or any protection on the staircase. There's also a very funny inversion of something from Dark Souls 1 here that is pretty baffling to me. These short staircases outside the main entrance previously had asymmetrical railings. The one on this side was taller, while the one on the opposite side was shorter. Yet the problem here in Dark Souls 1 is that their collision was symmetrical. The taller railing didn't get proper collision to match its visible height, but it did get taller high poly collision that your feet would sometimes try and magnetize to. So walking up and down this railing did a funny thing where your character would alternate between clipping through the railing and bouncing up and down to try and look like they're walking on top of it. Now in Dark Souls 3, you would think that they fixed this obscure minor issue because the railings were designed to finally be symmetrical. One is no longer taller than the other, So one would assume that their visible height was fixed to match the collision. But for some inexplicable reason, the exact opposite happened. Now it's the collision that's asymmetrical. The problem isn't as obvious here because the high poly collision is once again accurate, so the inverse kinematics of the player character does its best to make them appear to be walking on the railing, but it's not perfect and can be a little funny here too. So how does this happen? How do you screw up the same set of railings twice, inverting what was wrong about it while you were fixing it? The only thing I can think of is that maybe, in the process of porting Anor Londo into Dark Souls 3, at some point they re-exported the original collisions of Dark Souls 1 Anor Londo, getting them to match the asymmetrical railings. So perhaps we're seeing something like a fixed version of Dark Souls 1 Anor Londo collisions on the staircase, basically how it was supposed to be in Dark Souls 1. But as they overhauled the look of Anor Londo for Dark Souls 3, since it's not exactly the same anymore, they perhaps changed the look of these railings, but forgot to fix its collisions yet again. It's far from a significant issue, no one is going to notice or care about this as it doesn't create any problems for the player, and you really have to go out of your way to jump onto the railing. But it is weird how it happened twice. I also spotted another invisible enemy wall that wasn't here in Dark Souls 1. Larger enemies were free to pass through this doorway, but now with this collision here, they're not. Which I find to be a pretty interesting consideration, because this was made for larger enemies, as it's once again floating above the ground, using that newer Dark Souls 3 technique I mentioned a little while ago. But what larger enemies are even here in Dark Souls 3? Isn't it just Silver Knights? The Sentinels are no longer here. But then I remembered that there's the Deep Accursed inside the main hall, and this must have been put here because of him. If you try luring him to this doorway, he can't fit through. And while it looks like he's too wide to fit through, as the legs of his model extend beyond both sides, that's not actually what his collision cylinder looks like for navigating through the environment. That's a more narrow sphere of sorts, one that would be able to fit through this doorway no problem. In reality, the enemy is too tall for the enemy wall that they put here, so I find that kind of fascinating. He looks like he's too wide to fit through here when he isn't really, and in order to make that a reality for us, they sneakily made him too tall instead, all while the player has no way of being able to tell the difference. And they also did the same thing for the boss room. Normally, when you find enemy walls lining a boss arena, you'd assume they're there for the boss. And to some extent they probably are. As they wrap around the whole room, they create some extra padding which likely keeps the boss away from nooks they might have risked getting stuck in. But it's also lifted off of the ground, which has nothing to do with the boss. Or at least I should say that if they were only concerned about the boss, these would go all the way to the floor. This shows a consideration for letting lesser mobs in and out of the boss room after the boss is dead and the fog gate has cleared, but it once again stops the Deep Accursed from coming in for the exact same reason. Doing the same "he should be too wide to fit through here" routine. Though they could have improved the placement of this by lifting it another foot or two, because a funny outcome of this is that the short deacon and the chubby deacon fit through no problem, while the taller one gets stuck. Oops. In Irithyll Dungeon, the iron bars are covered with taller invisible walls than we can see. On this outside staircase, the right side of the staircase got railing protection, which was likely placed to help prevent an unintended shortcut. However, a shortcut is still possible. Dropping from a little higher, we can land on a structure they didn't think to cover up or make slippery, which is just a hair under a 20-meter fall. But you'll probably need to cast the Spook spell or equip the Silvercat ring in order to negate the fall damage and pull that off. Which might sound confusing if you've watched my videos on fall damage in Dark Souls 1 or Elden Ring, as things that negate fall damage don't usually allow you to survive higher falls. Those items normally just eliminate fall damage for falls that are already survivable, but as long as you have full health before falling somewhere, the maximum survivable height should be the same. Or it should be the same if we're talking about other games in the series. Why do I sometimes need items like Spook to survive this? It's complicated. Dark Souls 3's fall damage is almost like a hybrid between other Souls games' fall damage and Dark Souls 2, where even being at full health sometimes isn't enough. The primary culprits being not having dexterity leveled up enough, or being unembered. Maybe I could talk about this more sometime in the future. Let me know in the comments if you'd like a Dark Souls 3 Dissected on fall damage. Anyways, it's interesting they spotted a potential shortcut here that they tried to cover up, but they missed a spot. I should also mention how the railing protection has this weird extra bit on its end. That's not something you see very often, but they were trying to protect getting on the other side of this railing from another angle of approach while they were at it. And for something out of left field I wasn't expecting at all, the entire Dragon Prayer area is protected with invisible walls as well. It's oddly generous. I'm not sure what makes this cliffside any different, and why they don't just let you fall off of it. It's a little unusual for a space like this. In that side path area that connects the Profaned capital back to Irithyll dungeon, we can find a spot where they either could have used an invisible wall, or at the very least, collision that matches the shape of this building. The facade on this side lacks collision, which isn't really an issue if there's nowhere we can approach there from, but this does extend to the pillar around this side, where the first sign that something's wrong is that it lacks textures on part of it and you can see through it. When you try to land on it, this happens. So this is another one of those spots that's been presented as a glitchy hiding spot from invaders, which is not great. Oh, but wait, there are high poly collisions which can get our feet to do this. So I take it back, this is pretty great. Enemy walls protect most cliffsides near the headless gargoyles. This isn't surprising because it's kind of funny when you can make flying enemies fall to their death, so it's best to avoid that. Though if you go far enough down this path, the enemy wall stops. Perhaps the developers rightly figured that it wouldn't be very likely for players to lure it down here. In terms of potential exploits, it might look a little funny that we don't have to go far at all from where this one lands to get behind the safety of an enemy wall, but its placement makes perfect sense. The gargoyle wasn't going to be able to follow us into this narrow hallway anyways, but allowing it to go all the way up to the outside of the hallway would have meant that it probably would have been pretty easy to make it fall off of the short wooden bridge. So covering up the bridge from the opposite side was the right choice here. Around the corner from the gargoyle, here's one aspect of the level design that wasn't handled as well as it could have been. When looking down from this ledge, you can spot a doorway over there. It looks like a potential secret area, and the prospect of surviving getting down there doesn't seem too implausible, especially when you consider that we can go around to the opposite side, where the drop-down path wouldn't be that high up at all. But this did turn out to be an out-of-bounds area. Not only are these openings blocked off, but the entire flat area down here that looked like it could have been a safe landing was covered up with a large invisible ramp that will plummet you to your death. It's very unsatisfying. I can't be the only person to have died here trying this. Sound off in the comments below if this also got your hopes up. And further down in the level, they flanked the staircase with a couple invisible walls, hoping to keep us away from a small out-of-bounds area they didn't intend for us to get to. However, they failed to protect that area when approaching from this side, meaning you can still get back there. This puts you on the opposite side of the invisible wall, so that's how you know they really didn't want you to be here. I like this one cute little invisible wall here. The developers didn't want you jumping on top of this, so they added this little guy. Aww. And the boss room had some potentially problematic spots covered over as well. But what I find curious about this is that in Splee's latest video on how to beat Dark Souls 3 without fighting any bosses properly, he had a fight where he took away most of Yorm's HP by shooting through the fog gate with the Millwood Greatbow. Since Yorm wasn't aggroed and he'd have his poise repeatedly broken, he was eventually pushed back into a corner, which caused him to clip into a weird spot where he got stuck and couldn't fight back when Splee did finally enter the boss room. What's confusing about this is how that area is covered with invisible walls. No matter how hard I tried to push Yorm back there as well, the invisible walls did their job and stopped that from happening. Also tried taking control of Yorm and walking him over there, and that didn't work either. So I imagine that some very specific positioning was required to pull that off. One that we have no idea what it looked like, because it happened from outside the fog gate. I'm assuming it's probably very difficult to replicate, but this serves as a reminder that not every plane of collision is foolproof. Sometimes enemies find ways to clip through them anyways. In the Archdragon Peak, lots of rocks and trees are protected with those sorts of custom invisible walls that were added separately, or afterwards, from the rest of the environmental collision. The Ancient Wyvern has some invisible guardrails for his combat space. I don't know to what extent these are necessary, since I'd assume that its AI gives it very specific movements and behaviors based on where you're standing. It's not like it just freely roams around here, but perhaps it's another situation of better safe than sorry. A few of the upper walkways later in the level also got these raised enemy walls. These sorts of raised walls are usually reserved for when there's a much larger boss or mini-boss that they want to be able to protect when they're not worried about lesser mobs. While there is a larger enemy in these locations who is blocked by it, it's still a little surprising to me because this is probably the least important enemy in the game to get one of these. It's like, yeah, sure, he is larger, so you could do this, but he's also a regular enemy who doesn't quite have mini-boss vibes in the same way. So the distinction for why they're okay with the smaller enemies potentially falling off, but not the bigger ones, is less clear than it usually is. But nonetheless, it reveals that they wanted you to fight these big boys properly. Over here, we have another invisible wall that makes this spot not as open as it looks. And over by the ladder to Havel, there's some railing protection, which means we can climb the ladder and then run off of the roof to land on top of it. You already know where this is going. I'm going to leave a bunch of floating messages here. We're like totally going to blow someone's mind, man. Here we have another dead dragon that they didn't want us climbing on top of, so here's what the collision for that looks like. I'd also like to point out some of the camera collisions found throughout the area. There's a surprising number of loose rocks and stones that were covered with camera collisions. A lot of this stuff is low enough to the ground that I don't think it would matter that much, and they're really not always this aggressive with making sure the camera stays in front of stuff like that. But of course it doesn't hurt and adds a tiny bit of extra polish. But most of the camera collisions found in the Archdragon Peak are pretty redundant and unnecessary. Bear in mind that regular environmental collisions and invisible walls, that aren't enemy walls, also already restrict the camera's movement. It's not like the whole map needs to be covered in special camera collisions if the environment is already sufficient. And so we can find some spots here where we can see what they were going for. Like here it's pretty obvious they didn't want the camera getting behind these boards, so they put some camera collision here. But they also wind up putting invisible walls in the same spots here anyways, which already would have stopped the camera from getting behind them, making most of this kind of pointless. There are camera collisions that match the shape of the invisible wall that we just saw a moment ago by the dead dragon, so that's also unnecessary. And one of those domed structures earlier in the level has its upper area covered up, but the camera doesn't even come close to reaching it, and it's not like the ceiling area has anything that would even get in the way of the camera. Having all this stuff here isn't bad for the level in any way, but it shows some overzealous usage of camera collisions that wasn't at all necessary. I think my favorite bit of camera collision in the whole game has got to be this piece here. There's just something kind of funny about not finding any other special camera collisions in this starting section, but this one branch, which was already partially covered by an invisible wall, had a developer wanting to cover it up anyways. And lastly, here's a look at the arena for the Nameless King. The arena floats above this walkway below, but when you haven't yet rung the bell to activate the fight, it's not like there's anything to stand on if you fly up there, as the collision won't be there yet. This is an example of having an event flag that can tell a collision to only be here under certain circumstances. This is something the Souls games do every now and again, but it's not super common. The vast majority of levels in these games don't have collisions that change with context. Making our way further into Lothric Castle, the Consumed King's Garden starts off with some very tall railing protection. And though we can jump to this weird disconnected stairway segment that doesn't serve any real purpose, there's a nearby rooftop they don't want us getting on top of, and so they covered that up. And there's a lot of messy geometry, bushes, etc. that was covered up in the courtyard and in nearby areas. The Osiris boss room once again has that enemy wall padding that extends a bit further out from the walls we can see, since nooks are always a risk for getting larger enemies stuck. As I mentioned earlier, this is fairly common in boss rooms. Heading up to the Dragon Barracks, we find lots of rooftop areas protected. While none of this rooftop protection is unexpected, I did find something a little curious inside this room where you get ambushed by a lot of enemies. The fireplace is surrounded by these small panels of collision. These are just here for the camera again. It seems like a developer might have been concerned about the camera being set a little too far back in this nook, in a room where you need to be aware of your surroundings because of how many enemies are here. But I don't think this actually helps in any way. If the concern was something like the archway above taking up too much screen space, that really only happens if you go out of your way to stand in the worst spot and try and give yourself the worst camera angle possible. The collision of the wall itself will push the camera forward as well, so it's not like the wall can really get in the way too much to begin with. Plus, these flaps of camera collision can have the opposite effect if the intent was helping us see better. Because if we're approaching the fireplace, it can shove our camera forward, and now we can't see as far around the player as we normally can. And it's just kind of weird to have this huge open space behind us, and then for the camera to unexpectedly jump around as if we're in a cramped space. Because these flaps aren't that tall, most players probably don't angle the camera low enough to ever notice this, so it's not a big problem, but I don't understand what they can possibly help with, and it would probably be better to not have them here. I wonder if something else used to be in this room, and maybe we're just finding leftover artifacts from something that wasn't fully removed properly. Outside the boss room, we can see a couple different techniques used to keep us off of the plants. Most bushes got simple invisible walls covering them, but because that type of design is risky if you could find a way to get on top of them or behind them, they did have to handle this other bush that you can drop down on top of differently. Instead, they gave it a ramp that slides you off of it. It shows some thoughtfulness in how they handled these, which makes it a bit funnier that they just ignored this nearby tree. Maybe they didn't care if you landed on it, which is quite easy to do, as it's just a fairly wide cylinder that doesn't actually have any branches. Inside this room over here, they apparently didn't want you landing on top of these bookcases. They did make the top of them slippery, so its front half will already guide you off of them, But to prevent you from landing on the back half and sliding towards the wall, a sloped invisible wall funnels you towards the front side of the bookcase. The Dragonslayer Armor boss room is protected with invisible enemy walls, and while I probably sound like a broken record pointing that out, because this is in so many boss rooms, it's perhaps more important here than anywhere else. It's because all of the railings and statues are objects that can be broken by the boss. The whole idea is that the perimeter of the arena can be destroyed to create an extra hazard for the player, while they didn't want that to be a double-edged sword for the boss. How many players actually die to gravity during this fight? I feel like it's probably not that many, so it might be somewhat of an underbaked concept, but nonetheless it's still an interesting idea. Outside the Grand Archives, sides of the staircase are completely covered over, so you can't get into the empty space around them. Moving inside, while railing protection isn't surprising, I found it curious that most of the collision on this walkway actually matches what we see, while only one much larger invisible wall was added afterwards to only one specific part of it. So what were they trying to hide? It turns out that if you got over this railing, you'd fall through this bookcase as it lacks collision on top, which is completely unlike the rest of the bookcases in here. This set of invisible walls also blocks off more bookcases around the side of the same general area, which seems oddly specific because they're pretty hands-off when it comes to the rest of the bookcases. But then when you remember that this is the area hiding the Titanite slab, which doesn't open up until you pull a lever later in the level, it seems most likely that they wanted to be extra careful about keeping you out of here to avoid trapping the player if they hadn't pulled the lever yet. Not that you can ever be fully trapped in a space like this, since you always have the dark sign to fall back on, but of course the developers are going to try their hardest to avoid situations where you would need to use it. Most railings in the area actually lack railing protection and have collisions that match what you see, aside from this one other staircase here. And though I just said a moment ago that they were hands-off with most of the bookcases in here, the top floor did see this set of them getting invisible walls covering the gaps between them. I don't think the player would have been able to squeeze into any of these spots, but some of them cut it pretty close, so this was still a good idea. On the Grand Archives rooftop, we find some of the usual railing protection on the stairs, but most of the outer railings along the perimeter don't have any extra protection, aside from this one area out back. This is because this is nearest to some rooftops below that would be survivable falls, so the developers wanted some extra assurance you wouldn't get over the railings on that one specific side. And now for something pretty wild, I noticed a weird patch of collision floating pretty far off in the distance, behind Lothric and Lorien's tower. Random floating planes of collision aren't too unusual because they're usually used for cutscenes. That is, any level that has a cutscene associated with it probably has a floating rectangle of collision somewhere, because even if your character is seen elsewhere during a cutscene, they virtually stand on top of these things while the cutscene is happening to load a customized set of draw groups so the cutscene only renders the necessary parts of the level. Here's an example from back in Firelink Shrine. Standing on top of this will de-render most of the level, aside from the beginning of the Cemetery of Ash, because this is associated with the starting cutscene when you crawl out of your grave, which doesn't need anything rendered aside from the start of the level and the skybox.
Rise from your grave.
So I assumed that this floating triangle was going to be the trigger for another set of cutscene draw groups, but it turned out to be something a lot stranger. Standing on it triggers an area title card, but since whatever this area was supposed to be doesn't really exist and didn't get a proper name filled out, we get to see the default text for a level title, which is ? Placename ? Alright, let's make our way over to the DLC. The painted world of Ariandel starts off with taller walls protecting the perimeter, something we always expect when it's conveyed with anything that appears somewhat gradual. They don't want us to find a way up these rocky hills after all. Though on this return path to the starting area, I was surprised to find this one nook off to the side that didn't get an invisible wall. There's something of a gap here. Normally just by looking at these rocks I'd assume you can't get over them, but it turns out you don't even have to jump on them, you can just walk right over them. I wondered if this was purposefully left open, like a last-second chance to bail from the group of enemies ahead of you, but it seems more likely to be an oversight, since they probably would have made this look different if you were intended to be able to drop down from here. And while you're standing on it, you can use this spot to get further up this hill, somewhere you definitely weren't intended to go. There's no immediate problem to going up here. As far as I can tell, you won't get stuck somewhere weird, nor fall out of bounds. But the developers still want to avoid this sort of thing whenever possible, because of the aforementioned issues with multiplayer. But that's not going to stop me from doing the message thing yet again. There are a few enemy walls by this starting area as well. One fully blocks off the section where the ice collapse happens, meaning none of the enemies from the starting area will be able to follow you, once again validating the players who like to run past everything. You could even go past this wall, draw the aggro of all the wolves, have them follow you up that side return path, and as long as you get them to drop down with you, they'll get stuck in the starting area too. It's funny watching all of the enemies pile up, unable to follow you or get back to their starting locations. Another enemy wall lines the cliffside, but this is another one that's raised off of the ground. It was only here to protect the giant wolf. And this enemy wall wraps around the entire area, including around the tower you get shot at from, and it also blocks the second ice collapse spot that leads towards the second bonfire. I also found this one small patch of enemy wall over here. Instead of protecting a cliffside or major area transition, it's just this tiny little spot where they were perhaps worried about this guy getting stuck. Though hiding back there won't do anything to protect you from ranged enemy attacks, I still see some cheese potential here. Heading on over to the Corvian Settlement, another enemy wall prevents enemies from following you onto this slide. In Dark Souls 1, enemies had trouble walking down slides to very comedic effect, so seeing this one blocked off here made me assume the same was going to happen. But using debug to move the enemy onto the slide revealed that they fixed that problem. They don't have a proper animation for sliding like the player does, so that inconsistency could be one of the reasons they covered it up, but at least they can walk on it normally. The sides of the slide are protected with invisible walls for the player as well. There's a speedrunning trick known as the wolf skip, where using glitches allows you to bypass fall damage to survive getting down to the grave tender faster. The reason this works in this particular way is because of the lack of kill planes. Even though the player is using a glitch to survive an otherwise impossible fall, the kill planes would still get in the way. What I found is that, closer to the Undead Corvian side of the map, we can find a couple other wolf skip variants that would also work, as long as you used a fall damage negation glitch due to the kill planes not sticking out as far as they should have. Jumping off of this taller rock that's sticking up near the bottom of the slide, you can clear this here. A little further into the Corvian Settlement, here's another spot where you can make it over the kill plane. And once you've made it out the other side of the settlement, here's another spot you can jump down from. This one's a little more tricky, but it's still possible. All of these potential exploits could have been avoided if they just made the kill plane stick out a few feet further. The Corvian Settlement is almost entirely without invisible walls, and this general openness allows for some other exploits like the Scream Skip. It seems pretty difficult, but there is a way to climb the rocks here because of that, and I'll link to another tutorial by Matt Apocalypse that shows how to do it. Though they did put one invisible wall over here to try to make you go around the gate correctly. Once we do get to the other side of the fence, things get a little weird with the collisions here in a few ways. There's a spot where we can sink underneath the ground a little bit. I believe the culprit here is an extra set of collisions underneath the ground that fight for priority when positioning our character. But the weirder part is that once we make contact with it, the high collisions unload. The thing about high collisions is that having them simply unload isn't unusual behavior. That happens all the time. Because it's a lot more effort for the game to handle thinking about lots of collisions with a much higher polygon count, they only load for local and adjacent set pieces to the ones we're standing on. Here we can see them load and unload ahead of us based on where we're standing. That would explain why more distant high collisions are never loaded for us, but it doesn't explain why ones we're currently standing on top of go away. That shouldn't happen, so that's pretty damn weird. I also noticed that toggling the high poly collisions into view here tanked my frame rate, dropping into and staying in the low 50s. That might sound like an expected outcome, we are rendering a bunch more stuff on top of the usual graphics, but because of how high poly collisions are broken up and don't load for more distant areas, it's actually not normally that resource demanding, and I can usually maintain a steady 60 FPS when capturing footage of them. So sinking into the ground isn't the only thing that's afoot here. I realized that when looking around, there is kind of a lot more of the high collisions loaded at once than is normal from here. Take that walkway in the distance. I would normally assume that that should be far enough away from us to not be loaded, and sure enough, walking closer to it makes it disappear before it then reappears, meaning it probably shouldn't be loaded from all the way back here. And as for something that definitely shouldn't be loaded, what the hell is that? Again, if high poly collisions are only supposed to be loaded in spots that are near to us, having a completely disconnected set piece that's floating far off in the distance says that something is very wrong here. Taking a closer look, it's a duplicate of the entrance of the building we were just standing next to, just kind of copy and pasted and sitting out here for no reason. So that's all to say, there's a bunch of jank with the collisions when standing outside of this building for some reason. In the nearby building, I also spotted a curious redundancy in collisions. Movable objects like rotating staircases and elevator platforms usually just allow the collisions of the objects to carry the player. That is, something like an elevator platform won't have environmental collision, it'll have that orange object collision I was showing earlier. So I was expecting the staircase that you lower here to work the same way, and while the staircase itself does also have collision data, it turns out that this is another location where an event flag toggles a permanent ramp of collision into existence the moment you pull the lever. This means that, if someone is at the ready in multiplayer, they could run onto an invisible ramp for a brief moment and have the lowering staircase clip through them. When we exit the area behind the illusory wall that leads to the descending branches to Pyromancer Tunnel, an invisible wall to our left blocks this out-of-bounds terrain. And let's take a closer look at these descending branches. Something that these get right is that they're pretty much never a pain in the ass to walk on, unlike some of the branches in Dark Souls 1. In my Dark Souls 1 video, I talked about how it was too easy to slide off of part of this Blighttown branch, and that was because the low poly collision matched the shape of the branch too exactly. Only the high poly collision should match the visual geometry so that our feet can be placed on it properly, but there should be something like a more flat, invisible walkway of low poly collisions on top of it. And in that video, I speculated that a later Souls game would probably do a much better job at that. Roll the tape. The middle of the platform has one spot that's a little more generous, but really most of this thing should have had flat, invisible boards covering it, which is probably how a later Souls game would have handled it. I made that guess without having actually looked at the collisions of later titles yet, but that just seemed like the obvious way to not make walking on something like that suck. And I'm happy to say, that's exactly what we see here. Invisible walkways that are a little wider and flatter than the branch they're on top of, which allows us to walk back and forth on them pretty comfortably without worrying about jank collisions that cause us to fall off. But I did find some other, more minor jank here. There's this one branch off to the side at the very top of the path, which is a sort of distraction path. This isn't one of the branches that you take to get to the bottom safely. And while I think that's fairly obvious, as this branch over here looks narrower and doesn't seem to lead anywhere good, while we have a more clear path behind us, I still don't like the way we were denied access to this incorrect branch. I think it just should have been covered in slippery collisions, but instead, we got a large invisible wall that shuts out pretty far from it, being quite close to where we're standing. So if we try jumping, we'll impact a very obvious invisible wall that we'll roll off of in midair. Again, it's not a big deal, but it's just a very unsatisfying obstacle from a visual standpoint. It breaks the illusion of the freedom of movement that we should feel like we have, which these games otherwise do a pretty decent job of maintaining. Not always, of course, but the invisible walls could be so much worse in these games. And the reason this one is as bad as it is because I don't think it's intentional at all. This isn't a normal invisible wall, it's the collisions to a part of the environment that probably used to be here, but doesn't exist anymore. The giveaway is not only its weird shape, but the fact that it has an invisible branch sticking out the bottom of it that shouldn't be there. So we're looking at the remnants of a branch that got moved or discarded. We can spot some more of this happening in the area, but it's more out of the way and not a problem in the same way. Here's another invisible branch of collision. Moving elsewhere in the level to the other set of descending branches, I didn't find any issues here, but I did want to point out something that I thought was a little funny. You wouldn't think you'd be able to stand on more narrow branches like this, but check this out. Perhaps an outcome of being more generous than the branches of Dark Souls 1 meant giving a spot like this an invisible platform that didn't need to be here. And it looks pretty silly when you see what the collision for it looks like. The bottom of the branch path has a set of enemy walls underneath it. They were probably concerned about enemies like the crabs wedging themselves underneath the branch. That should wrap up things here, so let's move on to our final destination for the video, Dreg Heap and the Ring City. By the start of the level, an invisible wall blocks off this mound here. They didn't want us to get too close to this tower, because if we could, it might look like we could land on this ledge and walk around it. On the side of this tower, there's an out-of-bounds nook that we could try and get to. There's nothing shielding our approach from above, so it almost looks like we're set up for success. But the devs saw this coming and covered the spot up with a ramp. No luck here. For our drop into the collapsed Grand Archives Tower, I figured we could display the collisions and de-render the map to see how wide our safe landing into the building actually is. It shows that there's nothing solid in the middle, which is why you can land between the windows and be perfectly fine. Here it looks like they were worried about the angle of this wall being an issue if you walked into it, so an invisible wall not part of the environment's original collision was added here to help keep you away from it. At the landing that puts you next to the Divine Blessing, they protected the out-of-bounds area behind us with a set of invisible walls. And moving forward from here, we find some more of that wall padding that was added on afterwards. Further into the level, some of the branches that act as barriers have taller invisible walls to help ensure that they'd actually function as walls. And they put an invisible wall here to try and prevent a shortcut that gets you to the end of the level faster. However, there is still a skip that's possible, which is known as the Angel Skip in the speedrunning community. I'll put a link below to a demonstration by Distortion too. Speedrunners getting around a very deliberate invisible wall, you love to see it. Further down in the Twin Princes arena, they didn't have to do much with enemy walls because the entire area is surrounded with pretty tall, solid walls that block off all of the rocks for both the player and the enemies. However, I did find one specific patch of enemy wall that was added right here for whatever reason. Imagine one of the demons might have gotten stuck under this rock in playtesting at some point. The exit of the boss arena contains the ruins of the original Firelink Shrine from Dark Souls 1. You can't reach them normally, but the upper floors do maintain some of their original collision, so if you use cheat tools to get out of bounds, you can walk around up here a little bit. But they clearly never intended for you to go up here. Invisible walls protect most of it, as the whole area is covered with a massive shell of sorts. Entering the ringed city, we'll quickly find some rocks and tombstones that are covered up with invisible walls. The tops of trees are walled off as well. A lot of this sort of protection unsurprisingly carries throughout the rest of the level too, covering up a lot of the outer rocky walls you get to at the bottom. The Crystal Lizard over here had its entire escape route wrapped with an enemy wall, which is why you never have to worry about this one falling over the edge as it runs away from you. This would have been very welcome in Demon Souls. But the presence of this wall also means that if a skeleton follows you here, you won't be able to knock it off of the ledge either. Here's a bit of railing protection as we get further down into the level. And again, here we have some padding along the walls. Like earlier in the Dreg Heap, it looks like they were being extra cautious with this sort of architecture. And because this kind of geometry is common here, there's actually a lot of these small invisible wall panels. In the area where Silver Knight Leto invades, enemy walls protect the staircase so you can't get him to fall off of it or have him chase you further into the level. And while the railing by where he spawns is covered up, this other area out back isn't. So if you really wanted to get him with gravity, this is your one place to do that. We also have another one of those raised enemy walls that stops the large Judicator enemies from falling off of the cliff, while the smaller enemies are free to pass through. This building got an invisible wall on only this one specific side of it. They didn't want you getting on top of these columns, because then you could drop down to a spot where there's no way out alive. Here's a look at Meteor's Arena, which unsurprisingly covers the whole area up with an invisible wall for both the player and the boss. The staircase on the way to Filianor got a bit of railing protection, but after we interact with Filianor's egg, the same bit of architecture gets much taller invisible walls, probably because, unlike earlier, we wouldn't immediately fall to our death if we got out of bounds, so making sure we didn't get over the railing here was even more important. And I don't have too much to say about this arena, but here's a closer look at the whole thing. Before we end our tour of Dark Souls 3 collisions, I did want to close out the video with a minor collision mystery. The starting bridge of the Ringed City has a set of collisions wrapping it, but these collisions don't restrict the player, enemies, nor the camera. We can all just pass right through it. We find more of these wrapping a big chunk of the city below, and also wrapping some of the trees and buildings by the bottom of the level. These walls are of an unknown purpose. Given their proximity to the Judicators, it seems like they might have something to do with them, but I'm not sure how or for what reason. It's not like the spawning enemies can't see you or are unable to shoot through them, so it doesn't help with that. Maybe some of the spawning enemies were going to be a bit more mobile and could last longer and chase you around or something? And maybe they invented a new type of enemy wall that constrained only them, but not other enemies? It's a complete guess, but unfortunately I can't test it. While I can take control of basically every other enemy in debug, I don't think there's a way to do that for these summons without further modding that I don't know how to do. I did get confirmation from King Boar that this type of collision, Type 25, is not used anywhere else in the game. So if anyone knows why this kind of collision was added to the DLC and what it accomplishes, I'd love to hear about it. Okay, so here we are at the end of the video. I don't have anything to say about the collisions of the PvP arenas, but I'll close out with a montage of them, just so I don't feel like they were totally left out. If you made it this far, thanks so much for following me on my journey through the invisible walls and weird collisions of Dark Souls 3. And I guess for some of you, not just Dark Souls 3, but that wraps up the entire trilogy here. I'm also very happy to have finally dusted off Dark Souls 3 Dissected here. Seeing as I had only made one episode before, I know some of you were waiting for episode 2 almost as long as you were waiting for Silksong, and I hope you enjoyed it. I can't promise my next batch of videos will be about Dark Souls 3, in fact I'm pretty certain the next couple will be about Dark Souls 1 again, but I always intended to get back to Dark Souls 3 and there'll be more at some point in the future. If you enjoyed this video, please consider doing all of the things that help. Liking, subscribing, etc. All of that stuff really makes a difference. This is also my first video that's gone up since they've added the hype button. I have no idea what that does, but if you're hyped for more Dark Souls 3 deep dives, go ahead and smash the hype button too. Maybe that'll do something. You can also support me directly by becoming a YouTube member or on Patreon. That's patreon.com/illusorywall. An extra special thanks to all of my backers at the Evil Vagrant tier. Aranar, Basileus, Bob Manford, Europa, Gary Marshall, Inseritable, Jack Gerhardt, Kakaruma, Kiko Abad, Chris, Lazy Tangent, Majalis Duo, Matt, Piedfire Crest, Ronax, Trikids, Tridits, I might need help with that one, but good to see you here, and Zelthair. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.